Welcome to the Family Business Audiocast. I am Arvin Smith, creator of this Audiocast series, and today a very warm welcome to our live audience and for those listening also in the future. And I'm very pleased today to host my friends Luis Gomez Mejia and Ignacio Recueto.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us to the
Of course, thank you very much for having us today.
Okay, lovely. Wonderful to have you. I'm going to say a few words on you. Luis Gomez Mejia is one of the world's most highly cited scholars in business and economics, and he's widely known for pioneering research on family business behavior, also executive decision-making, and socioeconomic wealth. He is a Regents Professor and the Weatherup Obery Chair at Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business, and there he's published over 350 works in top-tier journals and received international honors from Carlos III, Oxford, Notre Dame, and other academic institutions. His empirical work has shaped how we understand the tension between family control and firm performance, and has helped families and researchers alike navigate the complex trade-offs that we have between legacy, risk, and growth. Wonderful to have you today. Also, Ignacio Recuejo is an award-winning scholar as well, specializing in the intersection of finance, governance, and family firms. He is also a professor of finance. He's at the University of Salamanca, a wonderful city, by the way. His research focuses on the mechanisms through which family control impacts firms' behavior, ranging from dividend policy and cash flow to long-term governance. His dissertation also earned top recognition from the Family Firm Institute, FFI, and his work has been published in leading academic journals, presented at institutions such as Oxford, EFERA, and London Business School as well. And he brings a very rigorous approach and lens to the challenges facing multi-generational families. I'm very delighted to have you both here today. Also, a mutual friend and professor, Fernando Munoz Bullon, and also Maria Jose Sanchez Bueno, were not able to join, but they were nice enough to set up this conversation. I want to acknowledge also their important contributions as co-authors of published research on family ownership and institutional investors that informs much of the decisions that are made today in the market. So thank you for making this episode possible. Luis, let's start with you. Just 1 minute on your background, please, and then we'll do over to Ignacio.
Well, I've been working in the family business area for 20 some years. Although I've been publishing in academia going back, about 40 years. And the question that came to my mind when I started doing this was, how does the ownership structure influence firm decisions? And when I started out in the year 2000 something, and I look at the statistics in the good journals, I was surprised that not a single paper in those journals have been published on family firms, not even one. And then I was even more surprised when I started looking at some statistics that 95% of firms around the world are family firms. 85% of firms in the United States are controlled by families. And 33% of the Fortune 500 firms are controlled by families. So that was kind of shocking to me that the so-called top-tier journals in management completely ignore family firms, when in fact they are the predominant ownership form around the world. Right? So that's what got me going into this. It kind of got my curiosity going. And the first real paper where we look at how family firms behave in a way that is different, and where the ideas of emotional wealth first came up, was a paper where we analyzed olive oil mills in Jaén, in southern Spain. Now, that may sound strange, olive oil, how does that fit into family firms? Well, Jose Moyano, who was one of the co-authors of that piece, he had access to some data on the olive oil mills, co-ops, and it turns out that Spain is one of the only country in the world actually that we know where if a firm wants to join a co-op, the co-op cannot deny you anything. And one of the arguments we made in the paper is that by joining the co-op cooperative, you get all kinds of benefits. You get tax benefits, you get technological support, you get marketing support, you get guaranteed pricing with the olive oil. So the obvious question that came to my mind at that point was, so why would any firm be stupid enough not to join the co-op where you get all these benefits, right? Where it turns out, as I began to talk to people, is that most of the firms, these are olive oil farmers, really. That's not a big company, but most of them were family ones. So the family olive oil producers were the ones that were more reluctant to join the co-op. And we also have some data where by joining the co-op, you get all kinds of financial benefits as well. Survival was greater. So then the question became, why would family firms, in that case, family olive oil farmers, why would they be reluctant to join the co-op? And that's where the ideas of emotional wealth came in. I should talk to them. They would tell you, the family farmers, they would tell you, if you join the co-op, you lose control. The co-op has a CEO elected by the board members. They impose rules and regulations on you. They control the technology that you're supposed to use. They do auditing, etc., etc. So we prefer to remain independent rather than join the co-op. And when you remain independent, you're taking the risk that financially you may lose money and you may not survive. So that's where the whole idea of system emotional wealth came in. That somehow there was a set of factors that were not economic or financial factors that led these family olive oil farmers behave differently. So that was the first paper that we published in Administrative Quarterly. And since then, we looked at a whole bunch of different variables.
I like that. I love that story. Es una mezcla de recursos y independencia, ¿no? It's a contradiction. So thank you for that introduction. And also, Ignacio, like maybe just another minute on you as well, and then we'll dig in. Peace.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, as you mentioned at the beginning, I am based at the University of Salamanca in Spain, and my PhD, I already started working and analyzing family firms mainly in Europe. And at that time, I worked and analyzed publicly listed family firms in Europe. And since then, although I've always been based in Spain, I've had the opportunity of visiting other institutions, mainly in the UK and Germany, where I have presented my work. And I have been targeting both finance and management journals. And to that aim, I have been able to get familiar with both the theories and methods used in those disciplines. And in my view, those complement each other very well because in terms of theories, management scholars, they are very insightful and they get very deep into the theory, while finance scholars, they put great emphasis on methods. And so I think that combining both, it is possible to conduct rigorous research, in this case, in the family business field. And so um, by working with colleagues from the different disciplines, I've been able to learn a lot, and that is how I have reached my current position today. And for instance, I've been working with Maria Jose and Fernando that you mentioned at the beginning, and also with Luis on a recent project. And this is what helps us, this kind of collaborations, this is what helps us to provide and make new contributions, in this case to the family business area.
Wonderful. Okay, that's great. I'll just give a brief overview of each of you, then we'll dig in for the 20-minute conversation. So Luis, who was just speaking first, he is one of the world's most cited scholars in business and economics. As I mentioned, widely known for writing Feminist Behavior and Socioeconomic Wealth. And his empirical work is quite robust in the family control space. And Ignacio himself also is an award-winning scholar specializing in the intersection of finance, governments, and family firms. That has a super rigorous lens to these challenges and multi-generational anyways. So Lise, we'll start with you. You're credited with shaping some of the socioeconomic and socio-emotional wealth framework. And this decides, in part within the family firms, their decision-making process, particularly as they create the wealth, as they manage the wealth, as they sell their companies. Maybe just walk us through a little bit this premise of SCW, the socio-emotional wealth framework, and how it challenges the conventional economic logic out there.
Yes. Well, by the way, I graduated in economics, so I do have an economic background, an economic bias myself. So, and the idea here is that, let me go back a little bit more. We developed another model before we got into socio-emotional wealth called the behavioral agency model, where we combine prospect theory with agency theory. And according to that model that we published in 1998, decision makers are loss averse to losses. So you're not always trying to maximize something. You're more concerned with losing. You're afraid of losing what you have, right? In the case of the family firm, we extended that model and argued that family firms are loss adverse to socio-emotional wealth when they make decisions. Okay, that was really the theoretical breakthrough. And because they're loss averse to socio-emotional wealth, they make decisions that are different from non-family firms. Now, what is socio-emotional wealth? Well, we have, we published a paper a number of years back, and this has been empirically corroborated. Socio-emotional wealth has a number of components. The enjoyment of control and influence by the family, very important. The identification of the family with the firm, where the firm becomes the mirror for the family. Right? This is my baby. I identify with the firm very strongly. The binding social ties between family members as well as employees that work with the firm. Emotional attachment to the firm. So this is an affective component that's very important to the family. And then dynasty. That is, we want the firm to continue in the future in the hands of the family. Okay, so those are basically the dimensions of socio-emotional wealth. Socio-emotional wealth mean, and so based on the loss averse argument, that family firms are adverse to losing the socio-emotional wealth. We published a bunch of papers, empirical paper mostly, looking at things like diversification. So you find that family firms diversified less. When they diversify, they tend to do it in related areas. They tend to avoid international diversification. And when they diversify internationally, they tend to go into culturally related areas. Okay? And those are empirical findings. And we provide that again as a emotional wealth argument to support it. When you diversify too much, you begin to lose this emotional wealth because you lose some of the control, you lose some of the emotional attachment, you lose some of the binding ties, etc., etc. Right? We did the same with acquisitions, and we found a similar phenomenon. The family firms are more reluctant to acquire other companies. Right? We looked at the caring of employees, and we had like a big sample of 60,000 employees in Brazil with 200 companies in Brazil. And what you find is that when you ask employees in family firms, they report that they're better cared for as compared to no family firms. And again, we made a social emotional wealth argument that for the family, emotions are important, identity is important, and the connection to the employees become very important, right? The paper that Ignacio was talking about with Maria Jose Fernando, we look at downsizing. And we have 33 European countries, and we actually replicated that in the US as well. Family firms are less likely to downsize, even if they're having financial problems. Okay? And again, we made this emotional wealth argument as to why this happened.
Right. So, Luis, that's wonderful. I'll take that into Ignacio now with a comment about his empirical work about this control that can affect performance, the levers of control of family enterprise, especially the larger family offices and enterprises, driving performance. Let's talk a bit about the patterns that you've uncovered with European family enterprises that relate to business success. So talk a bit about those control mechanisms and governance, Ignacio, and then we'll move on to another topic.
Sure, of course. Thank you, Adam. So as you have pointed out, that's true. I have worked in various projects on how family ownership influences business performance. In that regard, a priori one could think that family ownership is like marketing perfection in a way, because if markets were efficient, you wouldn't need to own a large fraction of shares of the business. However, what happens in reality is that capital markets are not totally efficient. And so that is the reason why we have some governance structures, like, for instance, in this case, family ownership. And what we find is that family ownership indeed plays an important role. Family ownership has its own pros and cons. And what we have found in our research is that the overall effect of family ownership depends on both factors that are internal and external to the business. Let me just share a couple of examples with you. For instance, talking about external factors, in one of the studies that derives from my thesis, we have observed that in countries with stronger investor protection, family ownership can sometimes be detrimental, particularly when they accumulate too much control. However, what we have also found is that in less protective settings, family ownership seems to be beneficial for publicly listed companies. That was one of the papers that came out of my thesis. In a more recent paper, we have analyzed unlisted companies. And there we show that the benefits from family ownership in terms of lower reliance on internal funds to grow, they are mainly true when family firms operate in a context where both investors and creditors are better protected by the institutions in place in their respective country. And so this finding points to the idea that family ownership and external regulation complement each other in facilitating business growth. Finally, I wanted to just share a final finding from a more recent paper, which I think is quite interesting. This is still an ongoing project, and this is with 2 German colleagues. And in this paper, which it hasn't been published yet, we are still working on it. Here we are exploring whether being a family firm is positive in terms of counteracting the potential negative impact of economic policy uncertainty. I think this is a very recent and interesting topic. What we have found, our preliminary findings point to the idea that economic policy uncertainty, this is negative in terms of value creation. So this leads to a destruction of firm value. However, the interesting finding that we have obtained is that family ownership partially counteracts this negative effect of economic policy uncertainty.
Okay. You both studied about the decision-making process and the drivers of the control decisions with family enterprises. What do each of you think remains the most misunderstood? If Ignacio, you picked one thing that's the most misunderstood in large family businesses. What do you think? And then over to you, Luis.
Well, this is a good question. What do I think is mostly misunderstood? Well, I think there is some basic fact that is very commonly misunderstood, which is that most people tend to think that family firms, they are just small and medium-sized enterprises. And though it is true that many SMEs are indeed family-owned, it is also true that among the large publicly listed companies, there is a large fraction of family firms. Luis mentioned this at the beginning. So I think this is one of the most misunderstood facts in terms of when it comes to the family business area. Similarly, I think there is the common belief that family firms, they lack professionalization. And while this might be true in some cases, I think that family firms, when they reach certain dimension, they usually put in place those governance structures that allow them to operate in a way that is comparable to any other type of company. So I think that those two would be some misunderstandings when it comes to talking about family firms.
Luis, how about you?
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree that people, when you talk about family firms, particularly even in academia, they think you're talking about mom and pop shops or small stores somewhere. It's clearly that's not the case. And actually, some of my earlier work before I got into family firms, ownership, if you own more than 5% of a large company, you have a lot of power and influence. Okay, even 5% as a single owner or a single entity would give you a lot of power. So if you look at even the Fortune 1000 firms, you'll be amazed, how often the family controls, 5% or more, and that gives that family a lot of power, right? Even companies like Microsoft, Motorola, U-Haul, Hewlett Packard, Marriott Corporation, IKEA. We can go on and on and on, where you have a family that owns maybe 5%, 10%, and that gives that family a lot of power in the company. So I believe that's one of the most misunderstood factors. A second misunderstanding is a stereotype that family firms are less efficient, that they don't perform as well in comparison to companies that are more widely dispersed without family control. And actually, if you look at all the statistics, all the studies that have been done, perhaps surprisingly to some people, family firms in general outperform no family. Okay, so there's a performance advantage to being a family firm in general, and it's not a big difference, but it's there, right? So the families actually somehow manage to handle social emotional wealth, and at the same time, on average, they outperform no family.
I'm aware. Yes, I'm aware of that study, and I'm very pleased to hear that as well. I appreciate you bringing it up again. There is I think there's a discount given in terms of perception in the world that family firms might be a bit smaller or more comfortable or less professional, but in fact that's not the case statistically, and it's very it's terrific to know that and share that. So guys, from your perspective, what distinguishes family firms like that evolve into more resilient, adaptive institutions from those that are more struggling between the generational transfer. I would love to hear from each of you. Luis first, like what do you think if you picked one characteristic that can distinguish the strength and the longevity, especially through the next gen transfer, what do you think that quality is? And maybe give us a comment or example of that.
Yes, again, I would say the main factor is a socio-emotional wealth that gives the family firm continuity that you don't find in no family firms. In no family firms, most managers don't last more than 4 years. And if you look at the average tenure of CEOs, it's surprisingly low. It's like 3.8 years. And the relationship between the employee and the firm is transactional, and it tends to be very transitory, where most people change jobs very often. When you look at family firms, you have top managers that tend to be there for a long time. One of the papers that we worked on with my colleague, Christina Cruz, typically a CEO in a family firm lasts for 17 years, 1-7. So you have that long-term perspective, the continuity that you don't have in the no-family firm. And that, to me, clearly that makes you more resilient in many ways. You're less concerned about what's happening next year or what's happening next month. You have a much more, long-term orientation by definition, because you're going to be there forever, right? I mean, that's what the family want to do. The family, that's part of emotional wealth. You want to remain wedded to the firm for a long time, and that to me is the main factor.
An example of that, give us a company, a large family enterprise in Europe that manifests this character.
I could give you an example. For instance, here in Spain, very well known case is Inditex. Inditex, the owner of the Zara brand. This is a very large publicly listed company here in Spain that has, I mean, it has survived over generations, and it is now handed over. I mean, the second generation is involved in the business. So I think probably, I'm not fully sure if this is the example for Luis's point, but I think this is a good example of a resilient and an adaptive family business in Europe.
Yeah, and they operate in many different countries too.
Yeah, I like that example. It's a great company, underappreciated, I believe, as well. So thank you for that. Let's talk a bit about the multidisciplinary nature of family enterprises. We know that the world is complex and integrated and competitive, and it's important to bring knowledge from other countries, other industries, internal, external. But family businesses in particular can have a harder time, particularly in major transaction events such as selling a company, bringing in external advisors, because it can be intimidating or there can be a trust factor. I'd like each of you to talk about the importance of multidisciplinary learning. Maybe talk about it either internally in terms of culture and intellectual capital, or externally, let's say more at the board or consultants. So, Luis, why don't you start on that, and then Ignacio.
Great. So the staff family firms, you need to have a good understanding. I mean, you have to use a multidisciplinary approach. Economics still important, finance still important, but then you have to look at the human resource factors, the psychological factors involved. Uh, the family firms clearly are a much more complex type of animal than the typical non-family firms, precisely because the enjoyment of control becomes important, because emotions clearly become important. Uh, and, but again, what's good at the end is that somehow family firms tend to manage that, and they tend to outperform no family. And And the other, to talk about culture too, makes a difference. We published a paper in the Journal of International Business Studies where you find that in some cultures, family firms enjoy what we call, we talked about constitutive legitimacy, which means is that, for example, in the Catholic countries, surprisingly, I mean, you do find cultural bikers where family firms become much more important. And if you look at the percentage of family firms in the, for example, UK, Australia, United States, the so-called Anglo-Saxon countries, you find a much smaller percentage. So somehow the overall culture also makes a difference in terms of how much support the family firm enjoys. So that's why you need to have a multidisciplinary approach when you look at family firms, when you look at why they make the decision they make, and why are they resilient? Why do they tend to outperform non-family firms? Uh, it's a fascinating area, very exciting. But there's so many different factors.
Yes, I totally agree. Multi-factor and that calculus is changes depending on the size of the company or the country or the culture or just can be also quite random. So it's hard to pin it down. How about you, Ignacio?
Well, yeah, I totally agree with everything that Luis has said. And I agree that family firms being more complex entities because of the emotional factor that affects the business, then it's important to bring to the table the different perspectives in order to make decisions that both may satisfy the family, but as well external stakeholders. So, in that regard, I would say that it is important that there are on some occasions you might need external experts to bring an objective view to the business in order, for instance, to establish a family protocol or in terms of designing a successful succession plan so that the company is transferred to the next generation. So as Luis mentioned before, the human component is vital, and hence it's important to find the right compromise between the emotional aspect and the financial aspect so that the company survives through the time at the same time as it is successful from a financial perspective.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to wrap up soon. We'll have one more item. Let's say, Ignacio, let's talk about the dissertation earlier on family firms. That dissertation won an award from SFI, or so the elite organization. If you think about that dissertation back then, a decade ago versus today, just tell us a bit about that thesis and what's different in the world today.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, this is, you're right that my thesis, which I finished in 2010, was about how family control affects the main financial decisions of the company. And so what has changed nowadays compared to when I finished my PhD is there has been improvements in terms of theoretical framing as well as analytical tools. So for instance, nowadays, the socio-emotional wealth paradigm that Luis mentioned before and that he developed is more established than what it was at the time. And so this is one improvement in terms of theoretical framing when it comes to family business research. At the same time, from an empirical point of view, from a methodological perspective, there is nowadays much more data than what we had at the time. And so you can conduct nowadays more rigorous empirical research where you can compare family to non-family firms and better understand how and why they differ from each other. So I think that those two aspects, improvements in theory and higher quality of data, might change how you can conduct family business research nowadays compared to when I finished my PhD.
Okay. And Luis, tell us a bit about that topic, in terms of the market changing, let's say, the last decade. We know that the market is much bigger because of wealth, but what has changed the last decade in the world, do you think, at the more elite level?
Oh, clearly, internationalization, globalization is clearly probably the biggest change in the market that we find. and the importance of innovation, rapid change, how you adapt to rapid change have become very important. The other thing that I would say very important in the market is the notion that how the firm treats stakeholders is is critical in itself, apart from the maximization of profits, right? So the whole argument of stakeholder management, whole literature on that. Uh, and what's interesting to me is that if you look at stakeholder management, uh, I would say, most of the most papers, most studies do show that family firms do manage to deal with stakeholders in a much more favorable way than non-family firms. You look at things like, again, employee caring, how much you get from employees. You ask employees, they will tell you that they prefer to work for a family firm. Downsizing. Again, you find the family firms provide much more job security than non-family firms. If you look at pollution, we have a number of papers on that. Family firms tend to pollute less in the same industry than non-family firms. Again, that's an externality that's very important in terms of stakeholder management. If you look at employee pension plans, surprisingly, family firms do better when it comes to that. So stakeholder management is another thing that has changed, I think, in the last 40 years.
Yeah.
Right.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I'm glad you brought up externalities. We won't have time today, but I think it's important that everyone thinking about the industry is aware of externalities and impact of the wealth flowing outside of the company, either building a larger organization, merging, building, buying, creating, distributing wealth into a community, into a city, into charities, into philanthropies, etc. This is a huge topic. We won't discuss further today, but it's important to keep in mind. But we can wrap with the last related comment about legacy, which is my favorite topic. I would love a 1 minute comment on the importance of legacy with larger families, and what do you think defines legacy the most, Ignacio? Primero a ti, para tu opinión.
Yeah, okay. I think that the founder vision is vital when it comes to legacy. I mean, when it comes to legacy, of course, you need to have a clear plan to make sure that the business is transferred over to the following generations. And this legacy comes both from a financial and a non-economic perspective. So, as you have pointed out, and I totally agree, family firms are not just about creating value for investors, which of course they do, but as well it is about creating wealth for other stakeholders, be it society at large, the customer, suppliers, and so on and so forth. So I think that legacy, when it comes to family firms, it is a much broader aspect, so that you want to leave your footprint in various aspects, not just economically, but also non-economically. And I think this is one of the important items aspects that characterizes family firms.
Yes, just to add a couple of things here. The fact that you have continuity in family firms, where again, the tenure of executives is a little longer, and owners, the dynasty is important for the owners. That gives you long-term perspective. So clearly, having that long-term perspective is what allows legacy to become so important. In that, I really care about what I leave behind. I'm not just looking at what's happening this year. I'm looking at, I care about what happens in the future and how they perceive the firm in the future. And I think, again, that long-term relationship is what makes a big difference, in my opinion, when it comes to legacy.
Okay. Thank you for that longevity. I would just finalize. We're over budget here, but I would finalize by saying the balance of entrepreneurship and creative, innovative thinking is often very difficult to combine with the strong founder mindset and G1 and original traditional legacy. So there's no right answer there, but it is very tricky. And I encourage those in larger families to keep that in mind and consider external consultants and advisors to try to blend the two. Complicated balance there. So with that note, I'd like to thank our Family Business Audiocast attendees today, our esteemed guests, Luis Gomez Mejia and Ignacio Requejo. Luis and Ignacio, wonderful to have you today. Thank you so much.
Thank to you.
Thank you very much for having us.
This is R. Adam Smith signing off. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Family Business Audiocast on LinkedIn.